The rain had been falling for hours, a relentless curtain of cold that seemed to drown the streets of Markham, Ontario in darkness. The kind of night where the world feels heavy, where even the shadows seem to whisper secrets. It was on a night like this that I first heard the call. A robbery, they said, turned violent at the Pan residence, a quiet suburban home where nothing much ever happened. But the night had other plans. When I arrived, the scene was already thick with the scent of tragedy. Two parents, hard-working immigrants who'd built a life from the ground up, lay battered and broken. Bitch Pan was dead, her husband Han clinging to life by a thread. The kind of brutality that makes you question humanity. It had all the makings of a simple, if horrific, home invasion gone wrong. But something in the air, something in the way the daughter, Jennifer Pan, spoke, told me this story had deeper roots. This was no ordinary crime. As I would soon learn, beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family was a web of lies, deceit, and cold-blooded calculation that would lead to one of the most shocking revelations I'd ever encountered. This wasn't just a robbery. This was a conspiracy, a tale of a daughter's deadly deception, and it was my job to piece it all together. Act 1. The crime scene. The call came in just after midnight. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, cutting through the steady drum of rain against my windshield. A robbery and assault at a quiet, unassuming house on Helen Avenue. Nothing out of the ordinary for a city like Markham, where the biggest crime of the year might be a stolen bicycle. But something in the tone, a subtle undercurrent of urgency, told me this wasn't just another break-in. When I arrived, the street was awash in blue and red lights, the kind that bounce off wet pavement and turn the night into a kaleidoscope of chaos. Uniformed officers moved with purpose, securing the perimeter, while the neighbors peeked through their curtains, desperate for a glimpse of the tragedy unfolding next door. Inside the Pan residence, the scene was a macabre still life. The kind of sight that sticks with you, no matter how many times you've seen it before. Bitch Pan lay motionless on the floor, her life snuffed out by a series of gunshots that left her body crumpled in a way no one should ever see. Her husband Han was found nearby, barely clinging to consciousness, his blood pooling around him as he struggled to breathe. He'd been shot too, but fate had decided to leave him with the cruel gift of survival. The initial confusion was palpable. A robbery gone wrong, an easy conclusion to jump to. After all, the Pans were immigrants, hardworking folks who'd saved every penny to build a life here. Who would want to hurt them? It made sense on the surface. A home invasion, a struggle, things getting out of hand. But as the pieces started to fall into place, it became clear that this wasn't a simple case of bad luck. No, this was something much darker. The crime scene was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The house was ransacked, but something about it felt staged, almost too perfect in its disarray. The assailants had been efficient, methodical even. It didn't fit the profile of a random hit. And then there was Jennifer, the daughter, her eyes wide with fear, her voice trembling as she recounted the night's horrors. She spoke of masked men, of threats and violence. But there was something off, something that didn't sit right. As I looked around the room, taking in the scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story was far from over. The rain outside beat harder against the windows, as if trying to wash away the sins that had been committed within these walls. But the truth, like the blood on the floor, wasn't going to be so easily erased. This was just the beginning. Act 2. Unraveling the Truth. Jennifer Pan sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the picture of a grieving daughter. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from tears, or so it seemed. She spoke in a voice that trembled just enough to evoke sympathy, recounting the terror of the night. She described the masked men who had stormed the house, how they had tied her up, how she could do nothing but listen as they shot her parents. It was a story that should have stirred compassion, but something about it gnawed at me. The more she spoke, the more the words seemed to unravel. like a sweater pulled apart thread by thread. Her story, meant to stitch together a night of horror, was coming undone under the weight of scrutiny. Small details didn't add up, inconsistencies that stood out like jagged edges in a puzzle that should have fit together cleanly. Why had the intruders left her unharmed? Why was her phone conveniently left within reach, allowing her to call for help the moment they left? The kind of questions that tug at the corner of a neatly constructed lie. As we dug deeper, the facade Jennifer had so carefully constructed began to crack. Her life, one that seemed pristine on the surface, a dutiful daughter, a dedicated student, was anything but. Behind closed doors, Jennifer had been living a lie, one meticulously built on deception. Her parents believed she was a model student, destined for medical school. They believed she had earned scholarships, that she was working hard toward a bright future. But the reality was far different. Jennifer had been living a double life. The truth was, she had failed out of high school, never graduated, and had never been accepted into university. Every diploma, every transcript she'd shown her parents was a forgery, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion they demanded. And there was more. Her relationship with Daniel Wong, the boyfriend her parents had forbidden her from seeing. A relationship she had hidden from them, sneaking around, weaving a web of lies to keep it alive. The deeper we looked, the more tangled the web became. Jennifer's life was built on deceit, layer upon layer, until it was impossible to see where the truth ended and the lies began. The pressure of living up to her parents' impossibly high expectations had driven her to this, a secret life of failure and rebellion, hidden beneath a mask of dutiful compliance. And now, that mask was slipping. As the rain continued to fall outside, it became clear that Jennifer Pan was not just a victim. She was a central piece of this puzzle, one that had been carefully placed to mislead us all. But now, the picture was becoming clearer. This wasn't just a case of murder. It was a tale of betrayal, of a daughter's desperate bid for freedom from the life her parents had forced upon her. And it was only a matter of time before the full extent of her deception came to light. Act 3. The Murder Plot. The more we dug, the clearer it became that Jennifer Pan's lies didn't end with her secret life. They were the foundation of something much darker, something that defied the very idea of family. It wasn't just about escaping the web of deceit she'd spun. It was about severing it entirely. Jennifer didn't want freedom. She wanted her parents gone. Permanently. It started with whispers, half-baked fantasies of a life without her parents' iron grip. But those fantasies quickly solidified into something real, something deadly. Jennifer began to plot their deaths, not in a fit of rage, but with cold, calculated precision. She needed to find someone who could do what she couldn't, pull the trigger. Jennifer reached out to her boyfriend, Daniel Wong, a man with his own ties to the underbelly of society. He wasn't the type to shy away from getting his hands dirty, but even he hesitated when she first broached the idea. Killing someone, especially your own parents, wasn't something you agreed to over a casual conversation. But Jennifer was relentless, driven by a mix of desperation and the allure of a life finally free from the suffocating expectations of her family. Through Daniel, Jennifer was introduced to a man named Andrew Montemayor, a small-time crook with big-time ambitions. He wasn't the first person Jennifer approached, but he was the first to take her seriously. Montemayor wasn't interested in the morality of the job, he was interested in the payout. But even he didn't want to get his hands too dirty, so he brought in a couple of enforcers, David Milvaganam and Lenford Crawford, men who wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger for the right price. The plan was simple, in theory. Jennifer would leave the door unlocked, let the hitmen in, and they would take care of the rest. She wanted it to look like a robbery, something that would throw off the cops, keep the suspicion away from her. They decided on a date, November 8, 2010, a night when the rain would wash away any traces of what was about to happen. On the night of the murder, Jennifer followed the plan to the letter. She unlocked the front door and then retreated to her room, waiting. waiting for the sounds that would signal the end of her old life. The men entered the house, quiet, efficient. They found her parents in their bedroom. No time to react, no chance to defend themselves. The shots were fired quickly. 1, 2, 3, and then silence. But the plan didn't go off without a hitch. Despite their careful planning, something went wrong. Han Pan, against all odds, survived the assault. Bleeding, blinded, but alive. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Jennifer had wanted a clean break, no loose ends. But now, with her father still breathing, the threads of her plan began to unravel. As the hitmen fled into the night, leaving chaos and death in their wake, Jennifer did her best to play the part of the horrified daughter. She called 911, her voice trembling as she told the dispatcher about the attack. She even managed a few tears when the police arrived, but it was all for show. Inside, she must have been reeling, trying to figure out her next move, because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The aftermath was a scene of confusion and fear, just as she had hoped. But with her father alive, with the police already suspicious, Jennifer knew that the truth would come out. And when it did, the story of a perfect daughter would be shattered, revealing the monster she had become. Act 4. The investigation tightens. The investigation was far from over. What was supposed to be an open and shut case, a robbery gone wrong, was starting to show cracks. The forensic team combed through the Pan residence, looking for any trace of the masked intruders Jennifer had described. But the deeper they looked, the more things didn't add up. The first clue came from Jennifer herself. Her 911 call, meant to cast her as the terrified daughter, had a calmness that didn't sit right with the seasoned officers. She'd claimed to be tied up during the attack, but when the knots on her bindings were examined, they were loose. Too loose. Almost as if she could have freed herself at any moment. That's when the suspicion started to build. Jennifer's story was like a house of cards, and the detectives were about to knock it down. As the days passed, Jennifer was called back for questioning. The rain outside the station continued its relentless fall, almost mirroring the cold, methodical way the police worked to break her. At first, she stuck to her story, rehearsed and practiced like a script she'd played over in her mind 100 times. The masked men, the threats, the helplessness. But as the questioning grew sharper, more precise, her carefully constructed facade began to show signs of wear. The detectives picked apart her timeline, exposing the inconsistencies. They knew Jennifer was lying. It was just a matter of how long before she broke. And she did. Slowly at first, like a dam with cracks forming. Under the weight of mounting evidence, Jennifer's calm demeanor began to slip. She stumbled over her words, contradicting herself in ways that couldn't be ignored. And the detectives pressed harder, leaning into the cracks, widening them. It wasn't just her story that was falling apart. Phone records were pulled, and what they revealed was damning. Text messages between Jennifer and her co-conspirators painted a chilling picture of the crime's premeditation. They talked openly about the plan, about when to strike, about the money. Jennifer hadn't been the victim. She was the mastermind. The detectives knew it, and now they had the proof. But the final nail in the coffin was Jennifer's own emotions, or lack thereof. In the face of tragedy, grief was expected. What wasn't expected was the cold indifference she showed as the walls closed in around her. Even when her father survived, barely clinging to life, there was no relief in Jennifer's eyes. No fear for him. Only the subtle panic of a person realizing their plan had gone wrong. Terribly wrong. When they brought her in for one final interrogation, Jennifer had no more tricks left. Cornered by her own lies, exhausted by the weight of keeping up the act, she broke. Her confession came in pieces, disjointed at first, as if she still hoped to salvage some part of the story. But it was over. She admitted to orchestrating the entire thing. The hitmen, the plan to make it look like a robbery, the lies she'd told everyone, all to escape the life her parents had imposed on her. With Jennifer's confession, the rest of the pieces fell into place. Her co-conspirators were rounded up one by one: Daniel Wong, Andrew Montemayor, David Milvaganam, Lenford Crawford. Each had played their part, and now each would pay the price. The arrests came swiftly, the charges even swifter. Murder, attempted murder, conspiracy. The weight of the law was about to come crashing down on them all. Jennifer Pan, once the perfect daughter, now found herself in a far darker role. A puppet master who'd lost control of her strings, and the consequences would be hers to bear. Act 5. The trial and sentencing. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with curious onlookers, reporters, and the few friends and family members who had dared to show their faces. The rain outside had let up, but inside the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The trial of Jennifer Pan and her co-conspirators was the talk of the town. No, the talk of the nation. Everyone wanted to see how this twisted tale of deceit and murder would play out. The prosecution laid out their case with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. They didn't just present evidence. They dissected Jennifer's life, piece by piece. Every lie she'd told, every step she'd taken toward orchestrating her parents' deaths, was brought into the harsh light of day. The text messages, the phone records, her confession, they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Witnesses took the stand, each testimony more damning than the last. The detectives who had broken Jennifer's story wide open. The forensic experts who had found no signs of forced entry. Each played their part in building an unassailable case. But perhaps the most chilling testimony came from her father, Han Pan. Blinded, permanently scarred, he described the horror of that night, the betrayal of the daughter he had loved and trusted. It was a testimony that cut through the courtroom like a knife, leaving no doubt about the depth of Jennifer's betrayal. The defense tried to spin a story of a young woman pushed to the brink by the unbearable pressure of her parents' expectations. They tried to paint her as a victim in her own right, driven to madness by a life she couldn't control. But the jury wasn't buying it. They saw Jennifer for what she was: a cold, calculating mastermind who had plotted to kill the very people who had given her everything. It didn't take long for the jury to deliberate. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Jennifer Pan was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years, the same fate handed down to her accomplices. The gavel fell, and with it, the final chapter of Jennifer's carefully constructed life came crashing down. There would be no freedom, no escape from the life she had despised. Only the cold, unyielding walls of a prison cell. But the story didn't end there. In May of 2023, more than a decade after the crime, the Court of Appeal for Ontario ordered a retrial for Jennifer and some of her conspirators on the first-degree murder charge. It was a shocking development, one that stirred up old wounds and reignited public interest in the case. The details of what led to this decision were complex, rooted in legal technicalities and questions about the fairness of the original trial. For Jennifer Pan, the retrial offered a glimmer of hope, a chance to revisit the events that had condemned her. But whether that hope would lead to a different outcome remained to be seen. The rain had stopped, but for Jennifer, the storm was far from over. The past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you think you've run. And for Jennifer Pan, the consequences of her actions would continue to haunt her long after the courtroom lights had dimmed.